At 7:40 on a sleet-gray Tuesday in February, Diane Holloway fired the woman who cleaned her office for being 11 minutes late. By 2 o'clock that same afternoon, she was sitting in an estate lawyer's office on Hollis Street, listening to that same woman's name read aloud from her mother's will, beside $220,000 and one sentence that took the floor out from under her. The cleaner Diane had dismissed without looking up from her screen was the one person her mother had trusted at the end. And the sentence she left behind was not written for the cleaner at all. It was written for Diane. Diane Holloway's alarm went off at 4:50 every morning, and every morning she was already lying there with her eyes open. She did not believe in the snooze button. The snooze buttons was 9 minutes of letting the day get ahead of you, and Diane had not let anything get ahead of her in a very long time. Her condo sat on the 11th floor of a glass building overlooking Halifax Harbour, and from her bedroom window the container cranes at the far terminal stood in a row like patient machines, lit orange against the dark water. She found them calming. They moved only when there was a reason to move. She showered for 6 minutes, dressed in one of the charcoal and navy suits that hung in her closet in a careful gradient, and was out the door by 5:35. No coffee at home. Coffee belonged at the office, where it was fuel and not a ritual. By 6, she was at her desk on the top floor of Holloway Carrick Wealth Management, the firm her parents had built from 2 desks and a borrowed fax machine 34 years ago, the firm that now managed money for half the old families in the Maritimes and employed 180 people who mostly tried not to be on Diane's radar. She had taken over as managing director 4 years earlier. The same winter her mother stepped back, and she had grown the book of business by 60% since. She was proud of that number the way some people are proud of a clean kitchen. Numbers did not flinch. Numbers did not need anything from you. That morning she pulled up the operations report, the one with the small things on it, attendance and overtime and incident notes, the kind of report most managing directors never opened. Diane opened it every day. She believed the rot in any company started in the small things. 3 lines were flagged. One of them belonged to a woman named Florence Adjay, custodial staff, evening rotation, who had clocked in late 3 times in 5 weeks. On the corner of Diane's desk sat a small brass compass, old, the glass scratched, the needle a little lazy. It had belonged to her mother, who had carried it for no reason anyone could explain. Diane kept it there because it suited the brass lamp and the leather blotter. That was the only reason. That was what she told herself. 14 floors of the building below her, Florence Adjay had already been at work for an hour, though her shift didn't technically begin until 7. She always came early, not because anyone had asked, but because she had learned years ago that the people in suits did not like to see the cleaning happen. They did not like to be reminded that the bright lobby and the spotless boardroom were not simply how the world arrived each morning, that someone wheeled a cart and knelt on the tile and made it so. So Florence finished the visible parts before they came and let them believe in the magic. It was easier for everyone. She had been a pharmacist once. A good one, 15 years behind a counter in Kumasi, the kind who knew her customers' children by name and could tell from a man's face across the shop whether he'd come in for his blood pressure or for courage. When she came to Canada at 43, her license came with her and meant nothing. There were exams and bridging programs and fees and a wall of polite Canadian sentences that all came down to not yet. She took the cleaning job at Holloway Carrick because it was steady and it was honest, and her daughter was starting at Dalhousie in the fall. And a mother does what a mother does. She told no one at the firm what she had been. It was not their business, and she had stopped expecting it to matter. What no one at Holloway Carrick knew, not her supervisor, not the security guard, not a single person on any of the 22 floors she cleaned, was that Florence spent 3 evenings a week in a basement classroom across the Harbour in Dartmouth, working through pharmacology she already knew in her bones but had to prove she knew on paper. Class ran to 9:30. She caught the last good bus, got home by 10:40, slept 5 hours, and started again. It was why she sometimes arrived at work with stones in her eyelids. It was why, 3 times now, the ferry had been canceled for ice, and she had stood 11 minutes late at the time clock with her chest still heaving from running up Barrington Street. Nobody had asked her why. Nobody asks the cart. Diane Holloway was not having a good February. She had not had a good month since her mother died, 3 weeks before on a Sunday afternoon, alone in the sunroom of the house in the South End with a half-finished crossword on her lap. The home care nurse had found her. Diane had been on a call with Toronto when her phone buzzed with the second number, and she had let it go and called back 40 minutes later, and that was how she learned. She drove out. She handled the arrangements the way she handled a difficult close, venue and flowers and a short eulogy she delivered without her voice breaking once. And several people told her afterward how composed she'd been, and she took it as a compliment because she did not have a category for what else it might have been. What she could not delegate was the thing that arrived when the office went quiet at the end of the day. A tightness under the breastbone, a sense that some door she'd been meaning to walk through had quietly been bricked over while she was busy. That morning there had been an email from Francis Beaulieu, her mother's estate lawyer, confirming the reading of the will for 2 o'clock. Diane had stared at it for a moment and closed it. The timing was terrible. The timing of grief is always terrible to people who schedule their lives in 15-minute blocks. So she did what she always did when something pressed too close. She found something she could control. Gordon Pruitt, the head of human resources, came to her door at 7:35 with a folder he clearly wished he didn't have to carry. He was a careful man in his 50s who believed that process existed because people, all people, deserved a chance to explain themselves before a decision landed on them. He set the folder down and went through it quietly. The odd J matter, 3 late arrivals, all weather-related, all on ferry nights. His recommendation was a documented verbal warning. The standard first step, 18 months on the job, with not a single complaint before this. He also, more reluctantly, mentioned the other thing. A junior associate on 5 named Caleb had reported an envelope of petty cash missing from his desk drawer over the weekend, $200, and someone had said the words "the cleaning lady has a key to that floor," and the words had done what those words always do, which is travel faster than the truth and arrive ahead of it. Diane did not look up from her monitor. Has she been on that floor outside her shift? There's nothing showing that. The drawer wasn't locked. Frankly, it could have been anyone, or he could have. I'm not running an investigation over $200, Gordon. I'm running a firm that can't afford this kind of question mark on the custodial staff. Terminate her contract today. Gordon shifted his weight. She's owed a written warning first, and she hasn't been heard on the cash. Letting her go this morning, with that rumor circulating, it'll look like we found her guilty without. Protocol is what I decide it is. Diane finally looked at him. Process it. He held her gaze a beat longer than he needed to, then picked up the folder and left. He had worked with Diane long enough to know when a door had shut. What happened next was not on any calendar. Diane stepped out of her office to walk to the boardroom for the 9 o'clock, and there, just past the glass doors, on her knees beside a wheeled bucket, was Florence Adjay, wiping a coffee spill from the carpet edge, where someone had dropped a cup and not bothered to say so. Florence looked up. Diane stopped. Later, Diane would not be able to explain it. Maybe it was the lawyer's email still burning behind her eyes. Maybe it was the need to make one clean decision on a morning when everything else felt like fog rolling in off the Atlantic. Maybe it was only that she saw a flagged name kneeling in front of her, and the distance between deciding and doing collapsed to nothing. She told Florence her contract was terminated, effective immediately. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without heat, without apology. 3 people in the corridor heard every word, and not one of them moved. Florence stayed kneeling for a moment, the cloth still in her gloved hand. She looked up at Diane, and there was no anger in it and no pleading, only something closer to recognition, as though she had been waiting a long time for a morning exactly like this one and was only now finding out which morning it would be. She got to her feet slowly. She asked one thing. "May I finish wiping this? The carpet's wet. Somebody could slip on the marble just past it." Diane said nothing. Florence finished the spill. She wrung the cloth, snapped off her gloves, set them on the rim of the bucket, and wheeled the cart back toward the service elevator with the small dignity of a woman who has had things taken from her before and has learned not to drop the rest of what she's carrying on her way out the door. Her boots, salt-stained at the toe, made almost no sound on the floor she had just cleaned. The corridor stayed quiet after she'd gone. One person turned back to a monitor. Gordon Pruitt, by the elevators, gave the smallest shake of his head and said nothing. Diane went back into her office and shut the door, and for a second her eyes went to the brass compass on the corner of the desk. Her mother's compass, the needle drifting. Her hand was not quite steady when she reached past it for her laptop. Control. Always control. At 10 to 2, she parked in the underground lot beneath Francis Beaulieu's building and rode up to a conference room that smelled of old paper and lemon oil. Dark shelves of statute books no one had opened in a decade. A single window full of the flat, gray light of a Halifax winter afternoon. Diane sat alone at the long table. She was Eleanor Holloway's only child. There was no one else to take a chair. Francis Beaulieu was in her late 60s, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who had sat with enough grief to understand that silence often did more work than sympathy. She had been Eleanor's lawyer for 22 years and her friend for longer. She put on her glasses, opened the folder, and began. The first provisions were ordinary. The house in the South End to be sold, the proceeds to a foundation for newcomer settlement that Eleanor had quietly funded for years. The book collection to the Halifax Library. A generous and entirely expected sum to Diane, along with her mother's share in the firm. Diane listened with her hands folded, waiting for it to be over. Then Francis turned a page and read the next line the way a person reads something they know will change the temperature of a room. "I leave the sum of $220,000 and my cottage on Prospect Road to Florence Adjay, who reminded me, near the end, of the kind of company I once hoped my daughter and I were building." Diane's fingers went tight on the edge of the table. "I'm sorry. What name?" Frances looked up over her glasses. "Florence Adjay." The name moved through Diane like cold harbor water. She knew that name. She had said that name herself 6 hours ago, standing over a wheeled bucket. The image arrived before she could stop it. The gloved hands, the salt-stained boots, the cloth wrung out over the rim. Her mouth opened and what came out was thin. "That's the cleaner, from my building." Frances took off her glasses and set them on the page. Her expression did not change. Your mother spoke of her often, with a great deal of respect. Diane stared at the document as if staring might rearrange the letters. The ink held still, and under the shock a question was already forming, one she was not ready to ask out loud and could no longer keep from forming, which was simply, why? Why would a woman who had built a wealth management firm out of nothing leave $250,000 and her favorite place on earth to a stranger with a mop? And what did she mean? The company I once hoped my daughter and I were building. Diane did not drive home. She drove the long way around the basin and out toward Bedford, with no destination, past the slush-gray malls and the salt trucks throwing their orange light. And then she turned around and came back and sat in the dark of the parkade beneath her own building. With the engine off, turning one sentence over and over like a beach stone, looking for the crack that would let her dismiss it. By the time she rode up to the 11th floor, she had found one. Her mother had always been sentimental, the kind of woman who learned the names of the men who plowed her street and brought them coffee, who kept up with a waitress she'd met once on a trip to Cape Breton. Eleanor had given her warmth away to anyone who happened to be standing in front of her, and Diane had identified that softness early as a flaw and quietly corrected it in herself. Sentiment clouded judgment, and now, clearly, it had clouded her mother's. The woman was lonely. People had taken advantage of lonely, generous women since the beginning of time. She phoned Frances that evening, her voice level, her boardroom voice. "I need to ask you something directly, Frances. In the last 2 years, did my mother show any sign of decline? Any sign she was being managed, leaned on by someone close to her at the end?" Frances's answer came without a breath of hesitation. "Eleanor signed that will 16 months before she passed. I sat with her through every meeting. Her mind was as clear as yours is right now, Diane. Clearer some days. I made sure of it. Twice." Diane pressed the phone harder to her ear. Then why would she leave that much to a cleaner? The line was quiet. Then Frances said, gently and without 1 ounce of apology, "That's a question only your mother can answer. And she tried to, in that document, if you'll let her." Diane hung up. She set the phone on the cold quartz of the kitchen island and looked out at the cranes lit orange across the water. Somewhere out in that city, a woman named Florence Adjay was getting through an ordinary evening. A woman Diane had erased from her firm that morning with a single sentence. A woman who now sat at the center of her mother's last wishes. She could not hold the two pictures in one frame. The woman with the bucket, the woman in the will. In the world Diane had built, those two could not be the same person, and that, though she could not yet name it, was exactly the problem. Not hatred, not cruelty. Simply a failure of imagination so complete she had never once noticed its edges. She decided she would look into it. Not to honor the will. Not yet. To prove her mother had been wrong and to get the cleaner's name out of it cleanly before anyone in the family or the firm heard a word. She was at the office before 7 the next morning. She went straight to Gordon Pruitt's desk and asked for Florence Adjay's full file, and also, after a pause, for whatever security had on the missing envelope. Gordon looked at her for a long moment, said nothing about the fact that she had fired the woman the day before, and was now reading her record, and pulled both. The file was thin. Florence Adjay, 47. Hired 18 months ago, evening custodial. Previous occupation listed in her own careful hand. Licensed pharmacist, Ghana, 15 years. No complaints. 2 commendations, in fact, which custodial files almost never carry. Both from staff who'd taken the trouble to write them, one for a woman on 3 who'd been having a panic attack at her desk, and whom Florence had sat with until it passed. One from an analyst whose grandmother's pill organizer Florence had quietly explained over a coffee break when no one else could make sense of the prescriptions. There was a line near the bottom that Diane read twice. Under training, in the same neat handwriting, added 4 months ago. Enrolled, Pharmacy Relicensing Program, NSCC. Exams in spring. That did not fit the story Diane had been telling herself of, the story of a woman who had settled, who lacked drive, who was exactly where she belonged. This was a woman climbing a wall in the dark, 3 nights a week, asking no one to notice. Then she opened the security report on the envelope, and her stomach turned. The footage had been pulled. It showed plainly the associate named Caleb on the Saturday afternoon, alone on 5, opening his own drawer, taking the envelope himself and leaving with it in his jacket. He had reported it missing on Monday. People do strange things to cover small lies. The cleaning lady, who had not set foot on 5 all weekend, had simply been the easiest place for a rumor to land. And Diane had let it land, and used it, without asking a single question, to harden a decision she'd already made. A hairline crack ran up the wall she'd rebuilt overnight, and she could feel the pressure behind it. The file told her nothing about how her mother and Florence had ever crossed paths. For that, she would have to go somewhere she had been avoiding for a long time. She drove out to the house in the South End that afternoon, the tall, narrow house she'd grown up in, with the green door her father had repainted every few springs until he died, and she let herself in. It smelled the same. Old books and beeswax, and faintly, the soil smell of the plants her mother had kept on every windowsill. The crossword was still on the arm of the sunroom chair, a pen lying across it. No one had moved it. No one had come. She was standing in the sunroom, not knowing what she was looking for when a knock came at the front door. The woman on the step was somewhere past 70, small and solid, silver hair pinned back, a parka thrown over what looked like a house dress. She introduced herself as Pearl Donovan, 2 doors down, and said she'd seen the lights and wanted to make sure it wasn't someone who shouldn't be there. Then she looked at Diane's face and softened. "You're the daughter. You've got her eyes." Diane made tea she didn't want because the woman clearly had things to say, and Diane needed someone to say them. When she asked carefully whether Pearl had ever heard the name Florence, the old woman's whole face opened. "Florence. Oh, of course, Florence." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "That's how your mother met her, you know. Right out front, on the ice. Eleanor went down hard on the walk one morning, 2 winters back, February like this, and she couldn't get up, and she lay there long enough that it frightened her. Florence was just passing on her way to the bus, on her way to that overnight job of hers, and she stopped. Got down on the ground in the cold with her, got your mother up, got her inside, made her sit, took her blood pressure with one of those little cuffs out of her own bag, and stayed till she was sure, wouldn't leave. Eleanor told me that woman knew more about the pills she was taking than her own doctor did." Pearl smiled at the table. After that, they were just thick as anything. Florence would come Sundays on her one day. They'd do the crossword. Eleanor was teaching her the names of the garden things, and Florence was teaching Eleanor to cook something with peanuts and ginger that your mother could not stop talking about. They'd quiz each other. Eleanor with her crossword clues, Florence with her pharmacy book. The old woman's eyes came up, kind but not gentle. "Your mother was lonely, dear. After your dad, and after you got too busy to come round, she was lonely in that big house. Florence didn't take your place. Nobody could. But she was here. And sometimes being here is the whole of it." Diane said nothing. She pressed her fingernails into her palm beneath the table and waited until Pearl had gone before she went back into the sunroom and found in the small drawer of the writing desk her mother's journal. It was a cloth-bound book, the pages full of Eleanor's slanting hand. Diane turned to the last winter. One entry, a Sunday in October. Florence came. "We finished the cryptic in under an hour, which is a record for me and a joke for her. She studies for that exam like the building is on fire. I told her she'd already been a pharmacist longer than half this country has been alive, and she said, 'Eleanor, here I am, a beginner until the paper says otherwise. This is the kind of patience I wish my daughter had learned from me.'" Another, from November. "Florence told me a thing today I can't put down. A man in a suit at her cleaning job snapped at her for taking the main lift instead of the service one. She wasn't even angry. She said, 'Every lift goes to the same floors, Eleanor.' I laughed. Then I lay awake. That's our firm, of course. The whole reason your father and I started the thing was so people would be looked after, the small ones too. And I wonder now if Diane is running a house where the Florences of the world get told there's a separate elevator and that it's policy." Diane turned the page. Her throat had closed. The next entry stopped her cold. It was dated 4 months before Eleanor died. Near the time, Diane realized with a jolt that Florence had transferred from the night rotation onto evenings at Holloway Carrick. "I want to phone Diane and tell her Florence works in her building. I want to say, 'There's a remarkable woman scrubbing your floors and you ought to know her.' But I know my daughter. She'd say, "Mum, you've befriended my cleaner," and the way she'd land on the word cleaner would break my heart. So I'll say nothing, and hope. Diane closed the journal and kept her hand flat on the cover, as though pressing down on the words might keep them from reaching her. They had already reached her, she understood now. Her mother had not arranged the job. When Florence's first Canadian work fell through, Eleanor had simply mentioned the firm was hiring custodial staff. Florence had applied on her own, been hired on her own, and on her first morning had seen the founder's portrait in the lobby, Eleanor and the late husband in their good clothes, and understood exactly whose building she was cleaning. And she had never said a word, not to Eleanor, not to anyone, because she had come to work, not to trade on a friendship. And Eleanor, watching from a distance, had said nothing either, because telling Diane would only have confirmed the thing she most feared, that her daughter would look at Florence and see a title, a cost line, a bucket on wheels. Diane sat in her mother's chair, surrounded by the things her mother had touched, and thought about the last Christmas. She had promised to come. She'd phoned 2 days before to cancel. Something about year-end positions, something that had felt enormous at the time, and her mother had said, "It's all right, love, I understand. Work comes first," in a voice Diane had taken for understanding. She knew now it had not been understanding. It had been the quiet acceptance of a woman who had stopped expecting to be chosen. She found the letter last, in a thin drawer at the back of the desk, behind the main one, the kind of hidden space only someone who'd grown up with a desk would know to check. Diane had hidden notes in it as a girl. The envelope was unsealed, on the front in her mother's hand. For Diane, when the time comes, the letter inside was dated the same month as that journal entry. Eleanor's writing was stamped on the first page, the careful, formal hand she used when something mattered. She wrote that she knew Diane would not understand the will. She knew Diane would be angry, would go looking for a reason to set it aside, would question her mother's mind and her judgment and her motives, and that she knew all of this because she knew her daughter had watched her become who she was and loved her for her strength, even while she grieved what that strength had cost. She wrote about Florence. "Florence does not need my money to be a good woman. She was good long before a frightened old lady fell down on the ice in front of her. But I want her to have a season of her own, a season the world keeps refusing her. Not because she lacks anything, but because people look at her and see only the uniform and the color of her hands and decide they already know the whole of her." And then the letter turned to Diane, and the words landed like stones dropped into still water. "You will meet Florence, my love. You may already have met her and not known it. Because you look at people the way you read a balance sheet, you see the position and the number and never once the person. I am not writing to scold you. I am writing because I am afraid I am watching you become the very thing, your father, and I started this firm so that no one would have to suffer. I love you more than I have ever managed to say in a room with you." The last line sat alone at the bottom, set apart by a space that felt deliberate. If you read this and you feel only anger, then I was too late. If you read this and you feel pain, then there is still time. Diane set the letter on the desk. She looked out at the dark garden where her mother's beds lay under crusted snow. She did not cry, and she did not shout. She sat motionless in her mother's chair and felt, for the first time in her adult life, completely cut loose from the woman she had believed herself to be. The brass compass on her office desk, the one she kept for the way it matched the lamp, meant something else now. It was not a decoration. It was her mother, still pointing, still waiting for her to look down and see which way she was actually facing. She did not go to the office for 2 days. Gordon Pruitt called and she let it ring. The board, the clients, the urgent subject lines, all of it stacked up unread. She sat in her condo above the harbor with the letter on the coffee table and read it again each morning, and each time a different line cut deeper, until on the 3rd day it was only the last one she could hear. If you feel pain, there is still time. She understood at last that her mother had written it not as a test, but as a hand, reaching across something she'd feared her daughter would never cross. On the morning of the third day, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at a woman with gray beneath her eyes and hair she hadn't brushed. A woman who looked nothing like the one who walked into Holloway Carrick every dawn with her spine straight and her calendar memorized. She asked herself a question she had never once asked in a boardroom. What would my mother say if she could see me right now? And the answer came at once. Eleanor would say nothing. She would only look at her the way she always had, with patience and a little sorrow, the way you look at someone you love and cannot reach. Diane washed her face, picked up her keys, and went to find Florence Adjay, because going to her was what her mother would have done, and right now that was the only compass she had left. The address led across the harbor to a low brick walk-up in Dartmouth above a coin laundry, the windows fogged from the dryers inside. The stairwell was narrow, the handrail loose, a fluorescent tube ticking overhead. Diane climbed it in her good boots, hearing every step, hearing her coat and her watch, and the click of her heels against the worn linoleum, aware of herself in a way she never was, aware that she did not belong here, and that her not belonging was precisely the point. She knocked. There was a pause, and then Florence opened the door, still in an apron, a textbook open on the kitchen table behind her, and for a moment neither woman said anything at all. Florence did not look surprised. She stepped back and held the door. Come in, then. It's cold in that hall. The apartment was small, a single bedroom, a kitchen that was also the dining room, but it was kept with a care that was almost a kind of craftsmanship. A pegboard of small tools by the window, each one in its place, a shelf of pharmacy texts and a spiral notebook dense with handwriting. On the wall, a child's drawing gone soft at the edges and a photo of a young woman in a Dalhousie hoodie, the daughter. A pot of something with ginger in it was warming on the stove, and the whole room smelled of it. Diane sat in the chair, Florence offered, a plain, sturdy chair, and gripped its edges, and when she spoke, the words came out without any of the polish she wore like armor. I came to apologize, not only for firing you, for the 2 years you were in my building and I never knew your name. I never knew anything about you. And for the cash. I know now it was never you. I let people think it was, and I used it, and I'm ashamed of that. Florence sat across from her with her hands folded on the table, in no hurry to fill the quiet. When she spoke, there was no bitterness in it, and no warmth either, only the even voice of a woman who has learned to say hard things without wasting herself on anger. You're not the first who looked through me, Diane. I made my peace with that a long time ago. She held Diane's eyes. But your mother saw me from the first morning. On the ice, before she knew a single thing about me, she saw a person. Diane felt the weight of it settle in her chest. Why didn't you ever say you knew her? You could have used it. You could have said it that morning when Florence tilted her head, as if the question itself were a strange one. Because I didn't want a job that came from knowing somebody. I wanted one that came from how I work. Her eyes did not move off Diane's. And even that wasn't enough, was it? Diane could not answer. She tried. But the truth of it had sealed her throat, and all she could do was sit with it. After a while, Florence rose and went to the counter and came back with something small, wrapped in a square of the brown paper the corner store used. She set it in front of Diane. Your mother left this with me the last Sunday. She said she'd been meaning to post it and never got the nerve. She wanted you to have it from a hand, not a mailbox. Diane unfolded the paper. Inside was a photograph in a small frame, the colors gone a little warm with age. A woman in her 30s, her mother, young and laughing, on a dock somewhere with the sea behind her, holding a small girl on her hip. And the small girl had both fists buried in her mother's hair and her mouth wide open in a shriek of joy, the kind that only exists before the world teaches you to measure it out. Diane turned the frame over. On the back, in her mother's hand, faded but clear. My clever girl, the things that matter most never pay any interest. Look up from the ledger sometimes. She held it against her chest with both hands and could not speak. Florence let her be. Then she said quietly, "She knew you'd come here, you know. She told me so. Not that she was certain, just that she hadn't stopped hoping. She said, 'Florence, my daughter isn't a hard woman, she's a lost one. And sometimes a lost person needs someone to stand still long enough that she can find her way back.'" Florence smiled, very faintly, so I stood still. Diane wiped her face with the heel of her hand. After a long moment, she found her voice and offered what she had come, in part, to offer, a position back at the firm, not custodial, something that matched who Florence actually was, something that began to make right what she had broken. Florence shook her head, not in anger and not in pride, with the plain certainty of a woman who had decided long before the knock at her door. "I sit my exams in 7 weeks," she said, "and then I'm going to do what I came to this country to do, on my own steam. Your mother gave me more than money, Diane. She gave me back the idea that I'm allowed to want the thing I'm good at. But I have to build it with my own 2 hands, or it won't be mine." She returned to Holloway Carrick the next morning. The receptionist looked up startled. 2 associates stopped mid-sentence in the hall. Diane walked past all of it and into her office and called Gordon Pruitt in. He stood the way he always stood, hands folded, waiting. "As of today," she said, "every termination in this firm goes through you before it goes anywhere. No exceptions, including mine, especially mine." Gordon studied her face for a moment. He did not smile and he did not congratulate her. He nodded once, picked up his folder and went out. He knew her well enough to understand that this was not a performance. It was a correction, and corrections don't ask for applause. Over the weeks that followed, she made changes, not with memos or all-staff speeches, but in the small, deliberate way of a person learning to see what she'd spent years walking past. A mandatory review before any dismissal. A hardship fund for staff caught in a bad season, not charity, a bridge. And one thing she had never done in 4 years of running the place. She learned the names. The man who plowed the lot. The woman who restocked the kitchens. The whole evening crew who made the building bright before the suits arrived, believing it had always been so. She was still Diane, still exact, still demanding, still allergic to excuses. But she had finally understood the thing her mother had known all along, that efficiency without humanity isn't leadership, it's only machinery. And machinery has never once built a company worth leaving to anyone. In May, a thick envelope arrived at the office. Inside was a single card. A storefront on a side street in the North End, freshly lettered on the glass, Odd J Community Pharmacy, and beneath it, smaller, Newcomer Council. Your questions answered in plain language. On the back, in a careful hand, Diane had come to know from a journal and a will 4 words. "You're welcome any Sunday." She went. On a Sunday in June, she stood across the street for a while first. Through the window, she could see Florence behind the counter in a white coat, leaning toward an older man, pointing at a row of boxes, taking her time, the way a person does when the work is the whole point and not the obstacle to it. There were chairs along one wall and every one of them was full. Small but hers. Florence looked up and saw Diane through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Florence lifted one hand, not a wave so much as an acknowledgement, the steady nod of someone who has arrived. Diane lifted hers back and did not go in, because the woman was busy, and being busy in a place of your own is a kind of glory, and you do not interrupt it. Eleanor Holloway did not leave that money out of pity, and she did not leave it to teach her daughter a lesson the cruel way. She left it out of respect, the sort that isn't earned by titles or reviews, but by how a person behaves on a frozen sidewalk when no one is watching and there is nothing to be gained. And the letter she left her daughter was never a punishment. It was an invitation. An invitation back to herself, because the true measure of a person was never printed on a name badge or stenciled on a door. It lives in how you treat the ones you've decided can do nothing for you at all. And if this story made you think, even for a second, of someone you've walked past 100 times without once learning their name, then maybe Eleanor's letter wasn't only for Diane. Maybe, in some quiet way, it was for whoever happened to be listening.